The cantina reeked of stale tequila and unwashed bodies, its adobe walls sweating in the oppressive heat of the Texas borderlands. Jake Morrison pushed through the heavy wooden door, his spurs jangling against the packed dirt floor as his eyes adjusted to the dim lamplight. He'd ridden hard from his ranch following rumors of stolen cattle being sold across the Rio Grande, but what he found inside made his blood run cold. In the corner, chained to an iron post like a wild animal, sat a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. His copper skin was mottled with bruises, his long black hair matted with dried blood. Despite the sweltering heat, he wore only torn buckskin leggings, his ribs clearly visible through his emaciated frame. But it was his eyes that struck Jake most. Dark, defiant, and filled with a pain that no child should ever know. "Soy gringo," called out Miguel Sanchez, the cantina's proprietor, a fat man with gold teeth and cruel eyes. "You want to buy something, eh? This little savage, he's for sale. Very good price, only 50 pesos. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd heard stories about the slave trade that flourished in these lawless border towns, but seeing it firsthand made his stomach churn. The boy looked up at him with those haunting eyes, and for a moment Jake saw his own son Tommy, dead these 3 years from fever. "What's his story?" Jake asked, his voice carefully neutral as he approached the chained child. Miguel laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "Comanche whelp. My men, they found him after we raided his village last month, killed his parents, burned their teepee. This one he fought like a wildcat, but chains, they tame even the fiercest beast, no?" The boy's eyes flashed with understanding. He spoke Spanish then. Jake noticed the fresh welts on his back, the way he favored his left arm. Miguel's taming had been brutal. 50 pesos, you said." Jake reached into his vest pocket, feeling the weight of his money pouch. It was most of what he had left after buying supplies for the ranch. "See, but hurry. Tomorrow I sell him to the mines if no one buys. They work him to death in 6 months, but they pay good money for strongbacks." Jake's hands trembled as he counted out the coins. The boy watched him with a mixture of hope and suspicion, as if he couldn't quite believe rescue might be possible. When the money changed hands, Miguel produced a rusty key and unlocked the shackles. "He's yours now, gringo, but be careful. Comanche blood runs hot. Turn your back on him, and he'll cut your throat." Jake ignored the warning, kneeling beside the boy. Up close, he could see the intelligence in those dark eyes, the pride that neither chains nor beatings had been able to break. "Can you ride?" he asked softly in Spanish. The boy nodded once, his voice barely a whisper. "Si, senor." "Good. We're leaving. Now." Jake helped the boy to his feet, feeling how his legs shook with weakness. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the Rio Grande the color of blood. His horses waited at the hitching post, his sturdy bay gelding and a spare mount he'd brought for the cattle drive that never happened. As they rode through the gathering dusk, Jake could feel the boy's eyes on him, studying him with the wariness of a wild animal. They didn't speak as they approached the river, its muddy waters reflecting the first stars of evening. The crossing was treacherous in the dark, but Jake knew every rock and current from years of running cattle across the border. "What's your name, boy?" Jake asked as they paused on the riverbank. "Ayana," came the soft reply. "But the Mexicanos, they call me different names, bad names." "Ayana," Jake repeated, the unfamiliar syllables feeling strange on his tongue. "That's a good name. Strong name. You're safe now, son. I'm taking you home." The boy's eyes widened at the word home, and for the first time since Jake had found him, something like hope flickered in those dark depths. They urged their horses into the current, water swirling around the animals' bellies as they fought the flow. Halfway across, Jake heard distant shouts from the Mexican side. Miguel had discovered their departure sooner than expected. Torches flickered to life along the riverbank, and Jake could make out the shapes of armed men mounting their horses. "Hold tight," he called to Ayana, spurring his gelding forward. The boy clung to his horse's mane with surprising skill, his face set with determination despite his weakened condition. They made the Texas shore just as the first shots rang out behind them. Bullets whined through the darkness, splashing into the water around them. Jake's ranch lay 5 miles north across open prairie that would leave them exposed to pursuit. "Can you make it?" he asked Ayana, who was swaying in his saddle. The boy straightened, his jaw set with fierce pride. "I am Comanche. I can make it." They rode hard through the night, the horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. Behind them, the angry shouts of the Mexican pursuers faded into the distance, but Jake knew they would face consequences for this night's work. He'd stolen valuable property, crossed international borders, and probably started a diplomatic incident. But as he looked at the boy riding beside him, freed from chains and heading toward hope, Jake Morrison knew he'd do it again in a heartbeat. Some things were worth the risk, worth the price that would surely come due. Neither man nor boy could have imagined that by dawn, that price would be measured in the thunder of 300 horses and the war cries of a people who never forgot their own. The first light of dawn crept across the Morrison ranch like a cautious animal, painting the weathered barn and modest adobe house in shades of gold and amber. Jake had barely slept, keeping watch through the night, while Ayanna lay unconscious on the narrow bed in what had once been Tommy's room. The boy's fever had broken just before sunrise, leaving him weak but lucid. Jake sat beside the bed, spooning broth into Ayanna's mouth with the patience of a man who'd nursed his own son through countless childhood illnesses. The boy's eyes followed his every movement, still wary but no longer hostile. Between them lay a gulf of language, culture, and bitter history that neither quite knew how to bridge. "Gracias," Ayanna whispered, the Spanish word coming easier than English. His voice was hoarse from days of screaming in Miguel's cantina. "De nada," Jake replied, one of the few Spanish phrases he'd picked up from his dealings with Mexican traders. "You need to get your strength back." Ayanna struggled to sit up, wincing as movement pulled at his wounded ribs. "Why you help me? I am enemy of your people." The directness of the question caught Jake off guard. He set down the bowl and studied the boy's face, seeing intelligence far beyond his years. "You're not my enemy, son. You're just a child who needed help. My uncle, he killed many white men, burned their houses, took their horses." Ayanna's voice carried no shame, only the simple statement of fact. "You know this?" Jake nodded slowly. He'd heard the stories. Chief Tahchee's raids had terrorized the borderlands for years, but looking at this broken boy, he couldn't summon the hatred that such knowledge should have brought. "I know, but you didn't kill anyone. You're not responsible for what others do." Ayanna's eyes flashed with something like surprise. "In my village, children of enemies are still enemies. White soldiers, they killed my baby sister. She had no weapon, but they killed her anyway." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought of Tommy, of the fever that had taken him, of the long nights holding his son's burning body. "I'm sorry. That was wrong. All of it was wrong." For a moment they sat in silence, the weight of their people's mutual hatred hanging between them like a storm cloud. Then Ayanna spoke again, his voice softer now. "Your son? He is dead?" Jake's breath caught. "How did you—" "Your eyes. They have the same sadness as my mother's when she spoke of my father." Ayanna touched a small leather pouch hanging from his neck. "She made this for me, to remember him. He died fighting the Bluecoats 2 winters ago." Jake reached into his own vest and pulled out a small tin-type photograph. Tommy at age 10, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. His name was Tommy. Fever took him. Ayanna studied the photograph with curious eyes. "He looks like you. Strong jaw, like bull." He paused, then added quietly, "I miss my father too." The simple admission broke something loose in Jake's chest. He found himself talking about Tommy, his laugh, his love of horses, his dreams of becoming a Texas Ranger. In broken Spanish and gestures, Ayanna shared memories of his own father, a war chief who'd taught him to ride before he could walk. As the morning wore on, Jake began to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. This wasn't just any Comanche boy. Ayanna was the nephew of Chief Tahchee, son of the war chief's deceased brother. The boy's disappearance would have sent shockwaves through the tribe, and his rescue by a white rancher would be seen as either an act of war or a trap. "Ayanna," Jake said carefully, "your uncle, he must be looking for you." The boy's face brightened for the first time since Jake had found him. "Tahchee? Yes, he searches. He never stops looking for family. He raised me after my father died. What will he do when he finds you here?" Ayanna considered this, his young face serious. "He will think you stole me, that you plan to sell me to the army or make me slave like the Mexicanos." He met Jake's eyes. "He will come with many warriors. They will want to kill you." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Even if I explain, even if you tell him I helped you, maybe. But white men, they lie much. Tahchee, he will not trust easily." Ayanna struggled to sit up straighter. "I must go to him, tell him you are a good man before he comes here. You're too weak to travel, you need—" "I am strong enough," Ayanna interrupted, his voice carrying the proud defiance Jake had seen in the cantina. "Comanche do not stay weak long." Jake started to argue, then stopped. The boy was right. Already his color was better, his movements stronger. But sending him back now, alone and still recovering, seemed like madness. yet keeping him might be worse. A distant sound made them both freeze, the thunder of hoofbeats, many horses riding hard. Jake moved to the window, his heart sinking as he saw the dust cloud rising from the south. It was too late for choices now. "Is that them?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Ayana joined him at the window, his face pale but determined. "Yes, my uncle comes." He turned to Jake, his young eyes old beyond their years. "You saved my life. Now I must try to save yours." The hoofbeats grew louder, and Jake could make out individual riders now, painted warriors on painted horses, their war cries echoing across the prairie like the howl of a hunting pack. At their head rode a man Jake recognized from wanted posters and whispered legends. Chief Tahchee himself, his face painted for war, his lance glinting in the morning sun. 300 warriors, just as the boy had said. They came not as rescuers, but as an army, and Jake Morrison realized that his act of mercy had lit a fuse that might explode into open war. "Whatever happens," Jake said quietly, "know that I'm glad I found you." Ayana nodded, his small hand finding Jake's calloused one. "And I am glad you did not leave me in chains." Together they watched the storm approach, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether compassion could survive the collision of two worlds bent on destroying each other. The earth trembled beneath the weight of 300 horses as Chief Tahchee's war party crested the ridge overlooking the Morrison ranch. Jake stood on his porch, his Henry rifle leaning against the doorframe, close enough to reach but not threatening enough to provoke immediate violence. Beside him, Ayana clutched the wooden railing, his knuckles white with tension. The Comanche warriors spread across the prairie like a dark wave, their painted faces and feathered lances creating a fearsome spectacle in the morning light. At their center rode Tahchee himself, a man of perhaps 40 winters, with the bearing of someone who had never known defeat. His war paint, black stripes across his cheeks and a white handprint on his forehead, marked him as a killer of enemies. "Tahchee!" Ayana called out in his native tongue, his voice carrying across the distance. "Uncle, I am here!" The chief's head snapped toward the sound, and Jake saw the moment recognition hit him. Tahchee's painted face transformed, years of worry and rage melting away as he spotted his nephew. He raised his hand, and the entire war party came to a halt, as if controlled by a single mind. "Little Wolf," Tahchee called back, using what Jake assumed was Ayana's Comanche name. "You live. The spirits have answered my prayers." Ayana stepped forward, his young voice carrying a strength that belied his weakened condition. "I live because of this man, Uncle. He broke my chains. He brought me home." Jake watched the exchange with growing tension, understanding none of the words but reading the emotions clearly. Tahchee's eyes never left his nephew, but Jake could feel the weight of 300 warriors' gazes upon him. One wrong move, one misunderstood gesture, and this prairie would become a battlefield. Tahchee urged his painted stallion forward, stopping just beyond rifle range. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear. "White man, I have something that belongs to me." "I have someone who needed help," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady. "Your nephew was chained like an animal in a Mexican cantina. I couldn't leave him there. And now you want payment? Gold? Cattle?" Tahchee's voice carried the bitter experience of too many broken promises. "What is your price for returning what you stole?" Jake felt anger flare in his chest. "I didn't steal anything. I rescued a child from slavery." "You lie," Tahchee said flatly. "All white men lie. You steal our land, kill our buffalo, take our children to your schools to make them forget they are Comanche. Now you steal my nephew and expect me to believe you are different." Ayana stepped between them, his voice sharp with urgency. "Uncle, listen to me. This man is not like the others. He fed me, cared for my wounds, asked nothing in return. He has honor." Tahchee's expression softened as he looked at his nephew, but when his gaze returned to Jake, it was granite hard. "Honor? This word means nothing from white tongues. I have heard it spoken by generals who massacred women and children. I have heard it from agents who gave us diseased blankets. Honor is what you do, not what you say." "Then judge me by what I've done," Jake said, stepping forward despite the forest of weapons pointed at him. "I found your nephew beaten and starving. I paid his captors and brought him to safety. If I'd wanted to harm him, why would I have freed him at all? Perhaps to use him as bait. Perhaps to draw me into a trap." Tahchee's eyes swept the horizon, clearly expecting to see soldiers rising from hidden positions. "Your army would pay much for Tahchee's scalp." "There are no soldiers," Jake said simply. There's just me, and a boy who needed help. A murmur ran through the war party, warriors speaking in low, urgent tones. Jake caught enough of their body language to know they were debating whether to attack immediately or wait for their chief's command. The morning sun was climbing higher, and sweat ran down Jake's back despite the cool air. Tahchee raised his lance, and the murmuring stopped instantly. You say you helped him, but white help always comes with a price. What do you want? Jake looked at Ayana, seeing the hope and fear warring in the boy's eyes. I want him to be safe. I want him to go home to his family. That's all I've ever wanted. And you expect me to believe this? You who profit from our misery? You whose people have taken everything from us? Tahchee's voice rose with each word, his stallion prancing nervously beneath him. I'm not all white people, Jake said quietly. Just like you're not all Comanche. I lost my own son 3 years ago. When I saw your nephew in those chains, I saw every child who suffered because of this war. I couldn't walk away. For a long moment, Tahchee studied him in silence. Then he spoke to Ayana in rapid Comanche, the boy responding with equal intensity. Jake caught his own name several times, along with words that sounded like pleas. Finally, Tahchee held up his hand for silence. My nephew speaks for you, white man. He says you treated him as a son, not as a captive. He says you have the same sadness in your eyes that he has seen in warriors who have lost children to war. It's true, Jake said simply, but words and even kindness do not erase the blood between our peoples. You have created a problem, white man. My warriors rode hard to find their lost brother. They are hungry for revenge against those who took him. If I tell them to ride away empty-handed, they will question my leadership. If I let you live, they will say I have grown soft. Jake felt the trap closing around him. Then what do you propose? Tahchee's smile was cold as winter wind. I will come with us. You will face judgment before the full council of our people. If they decide you acted with honor, you will be adopted into the tribe as my nephew's protector. If they decide you are just another lying white man, he shrugged eloquently. No, Ayana's cry cut through the morning air. Uncle, he saved my life. You cannot. I can and I will, Tahchee said firmly. This is the way of our people. Justice must be seen to be done, or there will be no peace. Jake looked at the sea of painted faces surrounding him, each one reflecting years of anger and loss. He thought of Tommy, of the boy who would never again fish in the creek behind the house or laugh at his father's stories. Then he looked at Ayana, alive and free because of a choice made in a moment of compassion. I'll come, he said, his voice carrying across the prairie. But I want your word that no harm will come to my ranch or my livestock. This is between you and me. Tahchee nodded slowly. You have my word. But know this, white man, once we cross the Rio Grande, you are in Comanche territory. Our law, our justice. There will be no cavalry coming to save you. I understand, Jake said, though his mouth had gone dry as dust. As if summoned by the mention of cavalry, a distant bugle call echoed across the prairie. Both Jake and Tahchee turned toward the sound, seeing a dust cloud rising from the direction of Fort Davis. The army was coming, drawn by reports of the war parties crossing. It seems our conversation must wait, Tahchee said grimly. My warriors did not come here to fight soldiers today. We came for family. He looked at Jake one final time. You have given me back my nephew's life. For that I will give you something in return, a head start. Take your horse and ride north. Do not stop until you reach the next territory. I'm not running, Jake said quietly. Then you are a fool, Tahchee replied, but there was something like respect in his voice. But perhaps that is what it takes to break chains in a cantina. The bugle call came again, closer now. Tahchee wheeled his stallion around, barking orders in Comanche. The war party began to move, but not before Ayana slipped from the porch and ran to his uncle's side. Tell them he is good man, the boy called to Jake in English. Tell them little Wolf remembers. And then they were gone, 300 warriors melting away into the prairie like smoke, leaving only dust and the echo of hoofbeats to mark their passage. Jake stood alone on his porch, watching the approaching cavalry, and wondering if his act of mercy had saved a life or simply delayed a war that had been inevitable from the beginning. The dust from Tahchee's war party had barely settled when Captain William Hayes led 2 companies of cavalry into Jake's yard, their blue uniforms dark with sweat and their horses lathered from hard riding. Jake remained on his porch, his hands visible and empty, knowing that any sudden movement could turn this encounter deadly. Morrison! Captain Hayes called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. What in Sam Hill was that about? We had reports of 300 Comanche warriors heading this way. Jake had known Hayes for 5 years, ever since the captain had been stationed at Fort Davis. They'd shared drinks and stories, but now Hayes looked at him with the suspicion reserved for potential Indian sympathizers, a suspicion that could prove as dangerous as Tahchee's warriors. They came looking for something that belonged to them, Jake said carefully. They found it and left. Something that belonged to them. Hayes dismounted, his hand resting on his saber hilt. Are you telling me you've been harboring stolen property, Morrison? Jake felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes upon him. The soldiers were tired, nervous, and primed for a fight that hadn't materialized. They needed someone to blame for their wasted morning, and Jake was the only target available. I rescued a boy from Mexican slave traders, Jake said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. Turned out he was Comanche. His uncle came to collect him. A Comanche boy? Sergeant Murphy, Hayes's second-in-command, spat into the dust. You brought a savage into Texas territory. Do you have any idea what you've done? I saved a child's life, Jake replied, his temper finally fraying. Since when is that a crime? Since that child belongs to Tahchee's band, Hayes said grimly. Do you realize you could have started a war? We've been tracking that war party for 2 days, expecting them to hit the settlements. Instead, they came here, to you. Jake saw the trap forming around him. In the army's eyes, he was either a fool or a traitor, and neither option would end well for him. They came for family, Captain. Nothing more. Family. Hayes laughed bitterly. Comanche don't have families, Morrison. They have war bands. And you just gave their war chief a perfect excuse to raid across the Rio Grande. He could have killed me and burned my ranch, Jake pointed out. Instead, he took the boy and left. That should tell you something about his intentions. It tells me he's planning something bigger, Hayes replied. Tahchee doesn't show mercy. He's the most dangerous war chief between here and the Staked Plains. The fact that he let you live means he's using you somehow. Jake felt the familiar frustration of trying to explain compassion to men who saw only strategy and threat. Or maybe he's just a man who loves his nephew. Sergeant Murphy, Hayes said, ignoring Jake's words. Post guards around the ranch. If Morrison is working with the Comanche, we'll know soon enough. I'm not working with anyone, Jake protested. I found a boy in chains and freed him, that's all. That's all? Hayes stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. You crossed international borders, stole valuable property, and brought a hostile Indian into Texas. You've probably compromised every peace negotiation we've attempted in the last year. Peace negotiations? Jake laughed harshly. Is that what you call selling children into slavery? Is that what you call letting Mexican bandits raid Comanche villages? What happens south of the Rio Grande isn't our concern, Hayes said, coldly. Our job is to protect American citizens from Indian attacks. Your job as a citizen is to report Indian activity, not encourage it. Jake felt the gulf between them widening with each word. To Hayes, Ayana was just another hostile Indian, not a frightened child who'd been torn from his family. The captain saw only military problems and political consequences, not the human cost of their endless war. Captain, Sergeant Murphy interrupted, we've got movement on the southern ridge. All eyes turned toward the horizon, where a small group of riders was approaching under a white flag. Jake's heart sank as he recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Tom Bradley from the county seat, accompanied by what looked like a Mexican delegation. Morrison, Hayes said grimly, it appears your little rescue mission has attracted even more attention. Sheriff Bradley rode into the yard with the weariness of a man who'd spent too many years trying to keep peace in a region that seemed determined to tear itself apart. Behind him rode 3 Mexican officials, their faces grim beneath their wide-brimmed hats. Captain Hayes, Bradley said, touching his hat brim in greeting. Jake. His tone was neutral, but Jake could see the disappointment in his old friend's eyes. We need to talk. I imagine we do, Hayes replied. What brings you out here, Sheriff? Senor Miguel Sanchez filed a complaint with the Mexican authorities, Bradley said, his voice heavy with resignation. Claims Jake here stole valuable property from his establishment. The Mexican government wants him extradited to face charges. Jake felt the noose tightening around his neck. Property? That boy was a human being, not property. According to Mexican law, he was legally purchased merchandise. One of the Mexican officials said in accented English, Senor Morrison committed theft and kidnapping. According to American law, Hayes said carefully, slavery is illegal. We don't recognize Mexican claims on human beings. But this did not happen in America. the official replied smoothly. "This happened in Mexico, where our laws apply. We demand extradition." Jake watched the political chess game unfold around him, knowing that his fate would be decided by legal technicalities rather than moral principles. The boy he'd saved was free, but the price of that freedom was apparently his own. "There's more," Bradley said reluctantly. "The Mexican government is threatening to allow Comanche raiders to cross freely into Texas if this matter isn't resolved to their satisfaction. They're saying American citizens can't violate Mexican sovereignty without consequences." Hayes cursed under his breath. "So we're caught between the Mexicans and the Comanche, with Morrison as the catalyst." "I did what was right," Jake said quietly. "I'd do it again." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," Hayes replied. "Sheriff, what are our options?" Bradley pulled out a folded document. "I've got a warrant for Jake's arrest. We can hold him for extradition proceedings, or—" He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Or we can let the Mexicans handle it themselves." "You mean hand me over to them?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "It would solve several problems at once," Hayes said thoughtfully. "The Mexicans get satisfaction. The Comanche lose their excuse for raiding, and we avoid an international incident." Jake looked around the circle of faces, seeing calculation where he'd hoped for justice. These men weren't evil. They were simply trapped by the same impossible situation that had created the war in the first place, but their willingness to sacrifice him for political expediency still cut deep. "What about the boy?" he asked. "What about Ayanna?" "The boy is with his people," Hayes said dismissively. "That's where he belongs. And if I hadn't rescued him, if I'd left him to die in those chains, then we wouldn't be having this conversation," Hayes replied bluntly. Jake felt a strange calm settle over him. He'd known from the moment he'd seen Ayanna in that cantina that there would be a price to pay. He'd hoped it would be worth it, and looking at the memory of the boy's face, free, proud, and alive, he decided it was. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "I'll come with you, but I want it on record that I regret nothing." "Jake," Bradley said, his voice pained, "there might be another way. If you were to publicly apologize, make restitution to the Mexican government, apologize for saving a child's life." Jake shook his head. "No, Tom. Some things are worth more than peace." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Jake caught sight of movement on the northern ridge. A lone rider sat motionless against the sky, watching the proceedings with obvious interest. Even at this distance, Jake could make out the distinctive silhouette of a Comanche warrior. Ayanna had not forgotten, and neither had his uncle. The boy's promise to tell his people that Jake was a good man might yet matter more than all the warrants and treaties in the world. But first, Jake Morrison would have to survive what was coming next. The jail cell in Fort Davis was little more than an adobe box with iron bars, but Jake had spent worse nights on cattle drives. What gnawed at him wasn't the discomfort. It was the knowledge that in 3 days he'd be handed over to Mexican authorities to face charges that could mean a lifetime in their minds or worse. Sheriff Bradley had done what he could, but politics trumped friendship in matters this delicate. Jake was dozing fitfully when the commotion started outside. Shouts, running feet, and the unmistakable sound of horses moving fast through the settlement. He sat up on his narrow cot, listening to the chaos growing in the streets beyond his cell window. "What in blazes?" came Captain Hayes' voice from the outer office, followed by the clatter of his boots as he rushed outside. Through the small barred window, Jake could see torches being lit throughout the fort. Soldiers scrambled to their posts while civilians huddled in doorways, their faces painted with fear and orange light. Then he heard it, the sound that had awakened every frontier settlement's deepest nightmares. War cries, dozens of them, echoing off the surrounding hills like the howls of hunting wolves. The door to his cell area burst open, and Sheriff Bradley stumbled in, his face pale and his hand shaking as he fumbled with the keys. "Jake, we've got a situation. Comanche war party on the ridge. Looks like the whole damn tribe." "Tahchee?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Him and about 500 warriors. They're not attacking, just sitting there, watching. Hayes is about to stroke out trying to figure out what they want." Jake felt a strange mix of dread and hope. "Maybe they're here for me." "That's what I'm afraid of," Bradley said, the cell door swinging open. "Hayes wants you to talk to them. See if you can convince them to leave peacefully. And if I can't," Bradley's face was grim, "then we've got the biggest Indian war this territory's ever seen about to start right on our doorstep." They walked through the fort's parade ground, past soldiers manning the walls with rifles and artillery pieces. The atmosphere was electric with tension. Men who'd fought Comanche raids knew exactly how deadly Tahchee's warriors could be in close combat. The fort's defenses might hold, but at a cost nobody wanted to pay. Captain Hayes stood atop the main gate, a spyglass in his hands as he studied the ridge. When he saw Jake approaching, his expression mixed relief with suspicion. "Morrison, your friends have come calling." Jake took the offered spyglass and trained it on the ridge. What he saw took his breath away. The entire hillside was covered with mounted warriors, their lances and rifles glinting in the torchlight. At their center, easily recognizable even at this distance, sat Chief Tahchee on his painted stallion. Beside him, a smaller figure on a smaller horse, Ayana. "They want to talk," Jake said, lowering the spyglass. "That's why they haven't attacked." "Talk about what?" Hayes demanded. "We don't negotiate with hostiles." "You might want to reconsider that policy," Jake replied dryly, "because I'm guessing they're here about the extradition." Before Hayes could respond, a single rider detached himself from the main body and rode slowly toward the fort. He carried a white flag, but also a lance decorated with eagle feathers, a war chief's weapon. As he drew closer, Jake could see it was one of Tahchee's sub-chiefs, a scarred warrior whose reputation for violence was known throughout the territory. The warrior stopped just outside rifle range and called out in accented English, "I speak for Tahchee, war chief of the Antelope Band. We come for the man called Morrison." Hayes stepped forward, his voice carrying across the distance. "Morrison is under military protection. We don't hand over American citizens to hostiles. You hand him to Mexicans," the warrior replied, his tone suggesting he knew exactly what was planned. "Mexicans who chain children. We say no." Jake felt the pieces falling into place. Somehow Tahchee had learned about the extradition, probably from the lone rider who'd watched his arrest. The war chief had come not to raid, but to prevent Jake from being handed over to the same people who'd enslaved his nephew. "This is madness," Hayes muttered. "We can't let Indians dictate American justice." "Can we let them start a war over it?" Jake asked quietly. Before Hayes could answer, another voice rang out across the prairie, young, clear, and speaking English with growing confidence. "Uncle Sam's soldiers, this is Ayana, nephew of Chief Tahchee, the man Morrison. He saved my life. He broke chains. He is good man. You give him to bad Mexicans, we fight." The simple declaration called out by a child's voice somehow carried more weight than all the diplomatic protests that had preceded it. Jake saw soldiers on the walls looking at each other uncertainly. These men had children of their own. They understood the debt being claimed. "Jesus," Bradley whispered, "the boy's vouching for you." Captain Hayes was silent for a long moment, his spyglass trained on the ridge where 500 warriors waited for his decision. Finally, he lowered the instrument and looked at Jake with something approaching respect. "Morrison, I think you've started something that's bigger than all of us." "I just helped a boy," Jake said. "Everything else is politics." Hayes turned to the messenger. "Tell your chief we'll talk, but he comes alone. No war party at the negotiation." The warrior shook his head. "Tahchee says white men lie when they feel safe. He brings 10 warriors. You bring 10 soldiers, we meet in the middle." "This is insane," Hayes muttered, but Jake could see him calculating odds and alternatives. 500 Comanche warriors camped on his doorstep would attract attention from Washington, attention that could end a career. Better to handle this locally if possible. "I'll go too," Jake said. "This is about me, after all." An hour later, they met on the moonlit prairie between fort and ridge. 2 groups of armed men circling each other like wary dogs. Tahchee had painted his face for war, but his weapons remained sheathed. Beside him, Ayana sat straight in his saddle, looking older than his 12 years. "You want to give good man to bad men," Tahchee said without preamble. "We say no. He saved my nephew. Now we save him. We have laws," Hayes replied stiffly. "Treaties with Mexico. We can't just ignore them because you object." Tahchee's laugh was like winter wind. "You ignore treaties with us when it suits you. Why not ignore treaties with Mexico?" It was a fair point, and Jake could see Hayes struggling with it. The captain was a soldier, trained to follow orders and respect chains of command, but he was also a man who'd spent years fighting a war that seemed to have no winners. "What do you propose?" Hayes asked finally. "Trade," Tahchee said simply. "We have thing you want. You have thing we want. What could you possibly have that we—" Hayes began, then stopped as Tahchee gestured toward his warriors. Several of them rode forward, leading horses laden with supplies and driving a small herd of cattle. "Stolen army horses," Tahchee said with a slight smile. "Stolen army cattle, stolen army supplies." We return all. Worth much money. You keep Morrison. No more raids this season. Jake watched Hayes calculating the value of the offered goods against the political cost of defying Mexican demands. It was a devil's bargain, but one that offered a way out of an impossible situation. And if we refuse? Hayes asked. Tahchee's expression hardened. Then we take Morrison anyway, and we take much more. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. 500 warriors could overrun the fort if they were willing to pay the price in blood. More importantly, they could disappear into the vast wilderness of the Staked Plains, taking Jake with them and leaving the army to explain how they'd lost an American citizen to hostile Indians. I need guarantees, Hayes said slowly. Written promises of peace. Words on paper mean nothing, Tahchee replied. But I give you something better. I give you my word as war chief, spoken before witnesses from both our peoples. Ayana suddenly spoke up, his young voice carrying clearly in the still air. Uncle, tell him about the ceremony. Tahchee nodded, his fierce expression softening slightly as he looked at his nephew. In our tradition, when a man saves the life of a tribal member, he becomes family. Morrison is now my brother by law of rescue. We protect family. Jake felt something shift in his chest at those words. He'd saved a boy's life, and somehow gained a brother, and 500 warriors willing to fight for him. Captain, Jake said quietly, take the deal. This war has seen enough blood. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. But Morrison goes free completely. No charges, no extradition, no restrictions. Agreed, Tahchee said. But he must come to our village. Ceremony must be completed. He is family now. Jake looked at the Comanche war chief, then at the boy who'd changed everything, and finally at the soldiers who represented a government that had been willing to sacrifice him for political convenience. The choice seemed clear. I'll come, he said, but I want to return to my ranch eventually. You are free to come and go, Tahchee replied. Brothers choose their own path. As they rode back toward their respective forces, Jake caught Ayana's eye. The boy smiled, the first truly happy expression Jake had seen from him, and spoke in careful English. Now you have new family. We take care of each other. Jake nodded, understanding that his act of compassion had created bonds that transcended race, culture, and the bitter history between their peoples. He'd saved a boy's life and discovered that mercy, like violence, could spread in ways no one could predict. Behind them, the first light of dawn was breaking over the Rio Grande, painting the sky the color of hope. The war between their peoples would continue, but for one night, compassion had proven stronger than politics. And sometimes, Jake realized, that was enough to change the world, one rescued child at a time.